Captain Hyenwoo Kim sat hunched in the darkest corner of Murphy's Cantina, the most run-down drinking hole on Nexus Station. The synthetic whiskey burned his throat, but not as much as the memories that refused to fade. His hands, marked with laser burns and shrapnel scars, trembled slightly as he raised the glass. 20 years had passed since the Outer Rim War ended. But the nightmares still came every night. The cantina was filled with the usual mix of traders, smugglers, and off-duty military personnel from a dozen different species. Steam rose from alien meals, and the air hummed with conversations in languages that would take a lifetime to learn. But tonight, one conversation cut through all the noise like a plasma blade through steel. At the table nearest to the bar, 5 young Zephyrian recruits were getting drunk on fermented algae wine. Their silver skin gleamed under the flickering neon lights, and their elongated heads bobbed as they laughed. Fresh out of their military academy, they wore their pristine uniforms like badges of honor, completely unmarked by real combat. "Humans got lucky, nothing more," declared the loudest one, a lieutenant named Vexari. His 3 eyes blinked in sequence as he gestured wildly with his drink. Their tactics were chaos. No formation, no discipline, no honor. They fought like wild animals. His companions nodded eagerly, their own drinks sloshing as they leaned forward. Another recruit, barely old enough to serve, chimed in with a voice full of arrogance. "My instructors said humans only won because they had better technology. Without their fancy ships and weapons, they would have been crushed in days. Primitive species always rely on tools instead of skill," Vexari continued, his voice growing louder with each drink. "Real warriors fight with strategy and courage. Humans just threw bodies at problems until something stuck." Captain Kim's jaw clenched, but he stayed silent. These youngsters had no idea what they were talking about. They had learned about the war from textbooks and training simulations, not from watching their friends die screaming in the vacuum of space, across from the Zephyrian table. Something stirred in the shadows. A massive figure rose slowly from a booth that most patrons avoided, his movement causing the nearby conversations to die down. Crystal was a legend on Nexus Station, though few knew his real story. The ancient Vorthan warrior stood nearly 8 feet tall, his 4 muscular arms ending in hands that could crush steel. His hide was deep blue-black, like the color of space between stars, and every inch was covered in scars. Some scars were clean lines from energy weapons. Others were jagged tears from close combat with claws and blades. But the worst were the burn marks that covered half his face, melting part of his natural armor and leaving his left eye a milky white. He had been beautiful once, by Vorthan standards. But war had turned him into something that frightened even his own kind. The cantina grew quiet as Crystal approached the Zephyrian table. His massive feet made no sound on the metal floor, a skill learned from decades of military service. When he spoke, his voice was like rocks grinding together deep underground. "You speak of things you do not understand, younglings." The Zephyrian recruits looked up, their 3 eyes widening as they took in the ancient warrior's massive form. Vexari tried to maintain his arrogant smirk, but it faltered when he met Crystal's gaze. "We studied the war extensively," Vexari said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Human tactics were documented as chaotic and inefficient. Crystal's throat sacs, located just below his jaw, began to inflate slowly. This was a warning sign among Vorthons, equivalent to a predator showing its fangs. The old warrior's secondary arms twitched, and several patrons quietly moved to other tables. "Studied," Crystal repeated, the word dripping with contempt. "Read reports written by politicians and academics who never held a weapon in combat. You learn from instructors who memorized battle statistics, but never watched their squad mates burn alive in a damaged shuttle." He pulled out a chair that groaned under his weight and sat down uninvited at their table. The Zephyrians shrank back instinctively, their survival instincts finally kicking in despite the alcohol in their systems. "I was there," Crystal continued, his good eye fixed on each recruit in turn. "I commanded a battlecruiser in the Vorthon, 3rd Fleet. I led boarding parties against human vessels. I watched planets burn and ships explode. I learned the hard way that everything our intelligence reports told us about humans was completely wrong. Captain Kim found himself leaning forward, despite himself. He had never heard a Vorthan veteran speak openly about the war. Most of them had returned home in shame, unable to explain how they had been defeated by what their leaders called an inferior species. The humans were not lucky, Crystal said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They were not chaotic. They were the most terrifying enemy any of us had ever faced, because they understood something that we did not. What? Asked one of the younger Zephyrians, his arrogance completely forgotten. Crystal's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile. They understood that war is not about honor or glory or following proper tactics. War is about making your enemy too afraid to fight you ever again. The ancient warrior reached into his coat and pulled out a small device, placing it on the table. It was a human military communicator, battered and stained with what looked like old blood. This belonged to Sergeant Deho Park of the Terran Marine Corps, Crystal said, his voice heavy with memory. He and 47 other humans were trapped on the mining moon of Kepler-7, surrounded by 3 full divisions of our finest warriors. Over 6,000 Vorthan soldiers against 48 humans picked up the communicator and turned it over in his massive hands. Any rational species would have surrendered. The humans had no chance of victory, no hope of rescue, no possibility of escape. Their situation was completely hopeless. Crystal's throat sacs deflated as he took a deep breath. Instead of surrendering, Sergeant Park sent us a message on this very device. Just 3 words that changed everything we thought we knew about human nature. The cantina had grown completely silent now. Even the background music seemed to have stopped as everyone leaned in to hear what came next. What did he say? Vexari whispered. Crystal looked up, his scarred face haunted by memories that would never fade. He said, "Come and take it." The old warrior's voice carried across the silent cantina like a death sentence. And then those 48 humans turned that little mining moon into a graveyard that still haunts the dreams of survived it. Captain Kim felt his hands begin to shake again as old memories surfaced. He had been there too, though, on the other side of the battle. He remembered Sergeant Park, remembered the desperate plan they had hatched in those final hours. Before the Vorthon assault began. "Let me tell you what really happened on Kepler-7, Crystal continued, his voice growing stronger as he prepared to share a story that would change everything the young recruits thought they knew about war. Crystal's frame seemed to shrink as he continued his tale, the weight of old memories pressing down on his scarred shoulders. The cantina remained dead silent, every patron hanging on his words like shipwrecked survivors clinging to debris. Kepler-7 wasn't much to look at, he began, his voice barely louder than the hum of the station's life support systems. Just a chunk of rock floating in the outer system, maybe 50 kilometers across. The humans had been mining it for rare minerals for about 10 years. Nothing special, just families trying to make a living in the cold darkness of space. He paused to take a long drink from his nutrient tube, the blue liquid glowing faintly in the dim light. Our intelligence said there were maybe 200 people living there. Miners, engineers, their families. A few security guards with basic weapons. We brought 3 full battle groups, over 6,000 of our finest warriors. Should have been over in hours. The old Vorthon's good eyes stared into the distance, seeing things that weren't there anymore. I was commanding the assault cruiser Vengeance of Keth back then. Brand new ship, fresh from the orbital shipyards. The crew was handpicked, all veterans of the Centauri campaign. We were proud, confident. We thought we were about to add another easy victory to our record. One of the younger Zephyrians shifted uncomfortably in his seat. What went wrong? Crystal's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile, but held no warmth. Everything. But it started with the silence. He described how the Vorthon fleet had surrounded the little mining colony, their massive warships, blocking every possible escape route. Standard procedure was to demand surrender, give the defenders a chance to lay down their weapons, and accept honorable defeat. But when they opened communication channels, they found only static. For 3 days we tried to reach them, Krikstal continued. Every frequency, every emergency channel, nothing. Our sensors showed the colony was still powered, still had atmosphere, but no life signs. We started to think maybe a reactor leak had killed everyone, or maybe some kind of mining accident. The ancient warrior's secondary arms began to twitch nervously, a sign of extreme stress among his people. Then Admiral Vorthek decided to send in probe drones. Simple reconnaissance, just to see what was happening inside. The drones made it about 50 meters into the main tunnel before they exploded. He explained how the explosions weren't random accidents. They were perfectly timed, perfectly placed to destroy the drones while leaving the tunnel structure intact. Someone was watching, waiting, planning. That's when we knew they were still alive, Krikstal said. But we had no idea what they were. Planning? For 3 more weeks, we waited. Our supply ships were getting nervous. Our crews were getting restless. The Admiral was under pressure from high command to finish the job and move on to the next target. The old warrior's voice dropped even lower, forcing everyone to lean in to hear him. Then Lieutenant Sojin Lee's voice came crackling over our communications array, clear as starlight, calm as deep space. She said just 3 words that changed everything. "Come and take it," whispered one of the Zephyrians, remembering the earlier part of the story. Exactly, Krikstal nodded. But it wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them. No fear, no desperation, just cold, hard promise, like she was inviting us to our own funeral. The ancient Vorthan described how the fleet commanders had argued for hours about the best approach. Some wanted to simply bombard the colony from orbit, turn the whole asteroid into space dust. Others insisted on a ground assault to capture prisoners and intelligence. In the end, military pride won out over common sense. We sent in the first shock division, Krikstal continued. 500 of our best warriors armed with the latest energy weapons and personal shields. They went in through the main airlock, expecting to find frightened miners hiding in storage rooms. His good eye closed as he relived the memory. Instead, they found empty corridors carved from solid rock. Emergency lighting cast long shadows everywhere. The air recycling systems were still working, but the place felt like a tomb. No sounds except the echo of their own footsteps. The first indication that something was wrong came when the advance squad reached the main junction. About a kilometer into the colony, the tunnel split into 3 directions, each leading to different sections of the mining operation. Standard procedure was to split the force and secure all 3 routes simultaneously. That's when the explosions started, Krikstal said, his voice growing harder. Not random blasts, but carefully planned demolitions. The humans had spent those 3 weeks studying our tactics, learning our procedures. They knew exactly how we would approach the assault. He described how the ceiling came down in sections. Not enough to kill the Vorthon warriors, but enough to separate them into small groups. Emergency blast doors slammed shut, cutting off retreat routes. The lighting failed in coordinated blackouts, leaving the invaders stumbling in darkness while hidden cameras tracked their every move. Private Jinho Moon was just 18 years old, Krikstal continued, his voice heavy with respect and regret. Whining engineer! Never held a weapon in his life before the siege, but he had studied our anatomy, learned our weak points. When he dropped from that ventilation shaft, he took out 6 of my best soldiers with nothing but a modified industrial laser. The young Zephyrians exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't the story they had expected to hear about human incompetence and lucky victories. The gas attack in the hydroponics bay was pure genius, Krikstal admitted. Corporal Haijin Choi was a plant specialist, knew everything about atmospheric chemistry. She had 3 weeks to experiment, to find exactly the right mixture of chemicals that would kill us but leave humans unharmed. He explained how the Vorthon respiratory system was completely different from human lungs. What smelled like fresh flowers to a human became deadly poison to a Vorthan. 30 warriors died in that bay, choking on air that should have been safe to breathe. But the worst part wasn't the traps or the ambushes, Krikstal said, his voice breaking slightly. Was the psychological warfare. They knew we were listening to their communications, so they started broadcasting fake distress calls. Children crying for help, wounded soldiers begging for medical aid. We would rush to investigate, only to find empty rooms and more explosives. The siege turned into a nightmare of cat and mouse, with the Vorthan forces becoming the prey. Every corridor could hide a trap. Every door could be the last thing they ever opened. The humans had turned their home into a weapon, and they wielded it with surgical precision. By the end of the first month, we had lost 800 warriors, Crystal said. The humans had lost maybe 20. But they weren't just killing us. They were breaking our will to fight. Every day brought new horrors, new surprises. We started to fear entering any room, opening any door. The old warriors' secondary arms were shaking now, and several patrons quietly left the cantina. This was becoming too intense, too real. The siege lasted 67 days, Crystal concluded. When it finally ended, we had lost over 2,000. Of our finest warriors, humans had lost 183 people. But they had turned those deaths into something that still gives me nightmares. He looked around the silent cantina, his scarred face reflecting years of guilt and trauma. We didn't win that battle. We survived it, and the humans made sure we would never forget the price of underestimating them again. Captain Kim finished his drink and stood up slowly, his own memories of Kepler-7 flooding back. He'd been there too. Fighting alongside Sergeant Park and Lieutenant Lee, the scars on his hands weren't from later battles. They were from that desperate 2-month siege. When a handful of miners had held off an entire alien fleet, the Zephyrian recruits sat in stunned silence, their earlier arrogance completely forgotten. They were beginning to understand that they knew nothing about war, nothing about the humans they had been mocking just minutes before. The temperature in Murphy's cantina seemed to drop several degrees as Crystal prepared to tell his darkest memory. Even the background hum of the station's ventilation system seemed to quiet down, as if the machinery itself was afraid to interrupt. Captain Kim felt his chest tighten, knowing what was coming next. He had heard whispers about Titan's Gate, but never from someone who was actually there. Crystal's massive hands trembled as he reached for his nutrient tube, the blue liquid inside glowing like captured starlight. His scarred throat worked silently for several moments before he found his voice again. Titan's Gate was supposed to be our moment of victory, he began, his words heavy with old pain. After the disaster at Kepler-7, High Command decided we needed a decisive battle to restore our reputation. Intelligence reported a human supply convoy passing through the Titan system, protected by only a small escort fleet. The ancient Vorthan's good eyes stared into the distance, seeing ghosts from 20 years past. We assembled the largest battle fleet in Vorthon history. 12 heavy cruisers, 30 destroyers, over 200 fighter craft. Against that, the humans had 1 aging battleship, 3 escort frigates, and maybe 60 fighters. The odds were so overwhelming that some of our captains complained it wouldn't even be a fair fight. One of the younger Zephyrians leaned forward, his silver skin pale in the dim light. What happened? Everything went according to plan at first, Crystal continued. We dropped out of hyperspace, in perfect formation, surrounding the human convoy before they could react. Their escort ships were outdated. Their flagship was a relic from the early colonial wars. The TRS Inchen was 40 years old, held together with spare parts and prayer. The old warrior's secondary arms began. That nervous twitching again. Captain Min Ho Yoon was commanding the Inchen. Intelligence files said he was past retirement age, probably given the assignment as a gentle way to end his career. Just a tired old man shepherding supply ships through safe space. Crystal paused to take another drink, his throat sacs deflating. With what looked like regret, he demanded their surrender over standard communication channels. Standard protocol, completely by the book. Give them a chance to lay down arms and accept honorable defeat. The silence stretched on until one of the Zephyrians couldn't stand it anymore. Did they surrender? Captain Yoon's response came back. Within seconds, Crystal said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He thanked us politely for the offer, and explained that his cargo hold was full of medical supplies and food rations for a colony world that had been hit by plague. He said those people would die without the supplies, so surrender wasn't an option. The ancient Vorthan described how the battle began exactly as expected. The human escort ships were destroyed within the first 10 minutes, their outdated shields collapsing under concentrated fire from the Vorthon fleet. The supply ships tried to scatter, but most were captured or destroyed before they could jump to hyperspace. The Inchin put up more of a fight than expected, Crystal admitted. Old ship, but her crew knew what they were doing. They managed to take out 2 of our destroyers and damage a heavy cruiser before we finally cornered them. His voice grew harder as he described the final moments of the battle. The human battleship was crippled, life support failing, weapon systems offline. Her hull was breached in a dozen places, and emergency lights flickered like dying stars. Any rational commander would have surrendered to save the lives of his crew. That's when Captain Yoon activated Last Stand Protocol, Crixtal said, and the temperature in the cantina seemed to drop another few degrees. We had never heard that term before. Our translators couldn't make sense of it. We thought maybe it was some kind of advanced weapon system. The old warrior's 4 hands clenched into fists, the knuckles turning white under his blue-black skin. We were monitoring their internal communications, listening to damage reports and casualty lists. Then everything changed. The human crew stopped trying to repair their ship and started doing something else entirely. Captain Kim closed his eyes, remembering the classified reports he had read years later. The crew of the Inchin had systematically destroyed their own escape pods, ensuring that no one could abandon ship. They had welded blast doors shut, trapping themselves in different sections of the vessel. Most terrifying of all, they had begun manually overriding safety systems, pushing the ship's reactor toward critical overload. At first we thought they were just committing suicide, Crystal continued. Honorable death rather than capture. Many warrior cultures have similar traditions. But then, we started picking up their transmissions to Vorthon space. The ancient warrior's voice broke slightly as he relived the memory. They weren't just dying, they were broadcasting. Sending detailed messages to our homeworlds, to the families of every Vorthon warrior in our fleet. He explained how the humans had somehow obtained complete personnel files for the entire Vorthon battle group. Names, addresses, family structures, cultural traditions. Everything needed to craft the most psychologically damaging messages possible. Major Subinhan was the ship's communications officer, Crystal said, his throat sacs deflating with remembered dread. She spent the last 30 minutes of her life sending personal video messages to Vorthon mothers, describing in perfect detail how their sons had died and what horrors awaited anyone who continued to fight humans. The messages weren't random threats or desperate curses. They were carefully crafted psychological weapons, designed to exploit specific cultural fears and family bonds. Han had studied Vorthon society, learned their funeral traditions, understood their deepest anxieties about death and dishonor. She knew that Vorthon warriors believed the spirits of the unburied dead would haunt their families forever. Crystal whispered. So she made sure to describe exactly how the reactor explosion would scatter our remains across light years of space, making proper burial impossible. The explosion that followed wasn't just a desperate act of defiance. It was an act of calculated terrorism that would haunt the Vorthon military for decades to come. The Inchin didn't simply explode. She became a miniature star, her overloaded reactor creating a fusion blast that consumed everything within 50 kilometers. The radiation field made rescue operations impossible, Crystal said, his voice hollow with grief. We lost 6 ships, and over 3,000 warriors in that explosion. But worse than the deaths was knowing that none of those bodies could ever be recovered. He described how the radiation would persist for centuries, turning the battle site into a permanent memorial to human determination. Vorthon families couldn't perform the traditional death rites for their fallen warriors, meaning their spirits would wander lost forever according to religious belief. But Major Han's final transmission was the worst part, Crystal continued, his massive frame shuddering with remembered trauma. As the reactor reached critical overload, she looked directly into the camera and spoke one sentence that still echoes in Vorthon military academies. The cantina had grown so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed loud. Even the station's background noise had faded to nothing, as if reality itself was holding its breath. "We die so that others may fear to kill us," Crystal quoted, his voice barely audible. Then she smiled, and the transmission cut to static as the ship exploded. Captain Kim opened his eyes and found that his own hands were shaking. He had known Major Han personally, had served with her during the early days of the war. She had been a gentle person, always worried about her crew's welfare, always trying to find peaceful solutions to problems. The idea that war had transformed her into something capable of such calculated cruelty was almost too horrible to contemplate. The psychological impact was immediate, Crystal continued. Within hours, we were receiving reports of desertion and mutiny throughout the Vorthan fleet. Families were demanding their children be brought home. Politicians were calling for peace negotiations. The humans had turned their own deaths into a weapon that struck at the heart of our entire society. The old warrior looked around the silent cantina, his scarred face reflecting years of guilt and trauma. That's when we realized we weren't fighting a war anymore. We were fighting a species that had weaponized their own extinction. How do you defeat an enemy that treats death as just another tool in their arsenal? One of the Zephyrian recruits started to speak, then stopped. There was no answer to that question, and everyone in the cantina knew it. The Battle of Titan's Gate lasted 6 hours, Krikstal concluded. The psychological warfare that followed lasted 6 years. Every Vorthan family that lost someone in that explosion became a voice for peace, demanding an end to the conflict. The humans had turned our own grief against us. He stood up slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows across the now empty tables. Most of the other patrons had quietly left during his tale, unable to bear the weight of such terrible memories. Was the day we learned that humans don't just fight to win, Crystal said, his voice carrying across the silent room. They fight to ensure their enemies never want to fight them again. The air in Murphy's cantina felt thick and poisonous as Crystal prepared to share his most disturbing memories. The few remaining patrons had moved to the far corners of the room, as if physical distance could protect them from the horrors he was about to describe. Captain Kim's synthetic whiskey had long since gone warm, but he couldn't bring himself to drink anymore. His stomach was already churning with anticipation of what was coming. Crystal's massive frame seemed to collapse in on itself as he spoke, his voice becoming smaller and more fragile with each word. After Titan's Gate, our military leaders thought they understood human tactics. Desperate courage, willingness to sacrifice, psychological warfare. They believed they could adapt our strategies to counter these approaches. His good eyes stared at nothing, seeing memories that played out like movies in his damaged mind. They were wrong. The humans weren't just willing to die for their cause. They were willing to become monsters, the ancient Vorthan warrior described. How intelligence reports began filtering back from the front lines about strange new human weapons that didn't fit any known categories. Not energy weapons or explosives, but something far more insidious. Weapons that attacked the mind rather than the body. Dr. Jia Young-ko was a neuroscientist before the war, Crystal said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the stations. Life support. She worked at a medical research facility on New Seoul, studying brain patterns and consciousness. Peaceful work meant to help people with mental disabilities. He paused to take a shaky drink from his nutrient tube, the blue liquid, casting eerie shadows on his scarred face. When the war started, Dr. Ko volunteered for military service, not as a soldier but as a researcher. She wanted to help wounded human soldiers recover from trauma. The irony wasn't lost on anyone listening. A healer who became a weapon designer. A doctor who learned to inflict suffering instead of curing it. War had a way of twisting good intentions into nightmares. Her first breakthrough came by accident, Crystal continued. She was studying the brain patterns of dying human soldiers, trying to understand how trauma affected consciousness. Discovered that in the moments before death, human minds released a burst of neural energy containing their final thoughts and emotions. The old warrior's secondary arms began that familiar nervous twitching. Dr. Ko realized this energy could be captured, recorded, and then transmitted to other minds. She called them empathy bombs because they forced enemies to experience human death from the inside. Captain Kim remembered the classified briefings about Dr. Ko's research. The early prototypes had been crude, causing headaches and mild disorientation in test subjects. But as the war progressed and more human soldiers died, The weapons became increasingly sophisticated and devastating. The first field test was during the Battle of Proxima Station, Crystal said, his voice heavy with remembered horror. A small human garrison was about to be overrun by Vorthan assault troops. Dr. Ko's team had positioned empathy transmitters throughout the station, connected to the neural patterns of human casualties. He described how the Vorthan warriors had breached the outer defenses, expecting to find the usual desperate resistance. Instead, they encountered something beyond their understanding. As they stepped over human bodies, the transmitters activated, flooding their minds with the dying thoughts of the fallen soldiers. "Imagine experiencing death from inside someone else's mind," Crystal whispered, his throat sacs quivering with trauma. "Feeling your lungs fill with blood, your heart stop beating, your vision fade to black. But you're still alive, still conscious, still able to feel the terror and pain." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Vorthan warriors who had charged fearlessly into battle just moments before suddenly found themselves paralyzed by an intimate understanding of what death really meant. They felt the love these humans had for their families, their desperate desire to protect their children, their regret at dying so far from home. 300 of our finest soldiers were reduced to babbling wrecks in less than an hour, Crystal said, his voice breaking. They couldn't fight anymore because they understood too well what it meant to kill someone. The empathy bombs didn't just cause casualties, converted our warriors into pacifists. But Dr. Ko's research was just the beginning. As news of the empathy bombs spread through human military channels, other scientists began developing even more horrifying applications of the technology. Colonel Narration was a cybernetics expert, Crystal continued, his voice growing darker. Before the war, she developed prosthetic limbs for disabled veterans, medical miracles that gave amputees their lives back. But war changed her perspective on what cybernetics could accomplish. The ancient warrior described how Colonel Shin had access to hundreds of Vorthan bodies from previous battles. Rather than simply burying the dead, she began experimenting with cybernetic resurrection, not bringing them back to life, but creating perfect mechanical copies that could fool even family members. The Ghost Protocol went into effect during the siege of Cygnus Prime, Crystal said, his massive hands clenching into fists. Our forces had surrounded a human research facility, cutting off all supplies and reinforcements. Victory seemed certain. He explained how the siege had dragged on for weeks, with both sides taking heavy casualties. The humans were running out of food and ammunition, while the Vorthans were growing impatient with the prolonged campaign. Then the ghosts began to appear. "My clutch brother Vorthek had died 3 weeks earlier in an assault on the facility's outer defenses," Crystal said, his voice hollow with grief. "I had seen his body, held his funeral rites, mourned his passing. So when he appeared in my command bunker, wearing our family's battle colors and speaking in his own voice, I thought I was losing my mind. The cybernetic duplicate was perfect. In every detail, it knew family secrets, shared memories, even replicated Vorthek's distinctive laugh. For several precious seconds, Crystal had believed his brother had somehow survived his wounds and returned to the battle. Then it spoke in perfect human language," Crystal whispered, his good eye wide with remembered terror. "It described our defensive positions, our supply routes, our planned attacks. Everything we had discussed in private strategy meetings. The humans had turned my brother's corpse into a spy." The psychological impact of the Ghost Protocol was even more devastating than the empathy bombs. Vorthan soldiers began to distrust their own comrades, afraid that any familiar face might be a cybernetic infiltrator. Unit cohesion collapsed as warriors turned on each other, unable to distinguish between the living and the dead. "But Commander, Wu Jinbei's innovation was the most horrifying of all," Crystal continued, his voice barely audible now. "She was a nanotechnology specialist, working on medical applications for microscopic robots, healing devices that could repair tissue damage at the cellular level." The old warrior's secondary arms were shaking violently now, and several more patrons quietly left the cantina. This story was becoming too intense, too real for comfortable listening. Commander Bay realized that the same nanotechnology could be used to restructure organic matter into new forms, Crystal said. She began experimenting with Vorthan casualties, using nanobots to convert dead tissue into surveillance equipment. The process was slow and gruesome, taking several days to complete. But the results were beyond anything military strategists had imagined. Dead Vorthon soldiers were transformed into living cameras, their neural systems rewired to transmit visual and audio data back to human command centers. The worst part was the messages, Crystal whispered, his voice breaking completely now. Parents on our homeworlds would receive video calls from their supposedly dead children.
Thanks.
The nanobots could still access vocal cords and facial muscles, so the calls looked completely real. He described how grieving Vorthon families would answer these calls, expecting to hear final words from their fallen warriors. Instead, they found themselves listening to detailed intelligence reports about military installations, troop movements, and defensive preparations. Their own dead children had been turned into weapons against their people. The psychological warfare was perfect, Crystal said, tears streaming down his scarred face. Every family that received one of those calls became convinced that the war was wrong, that the humans were capable of horrors beyond imagination. They demanded their government negotiate for peace, no matter the cost. Captain Kim felt his own eyes growing wet as he listened to the ancient warrior's testimony. He had heard rumors about these weapons, seen classified reports that were immediately buried by military censors. The human capacity for innovation in warfare was both their greatest strength and their most terrifying weakness. None of these weapons were ever deployed on a large scale, Crystal concluded, his voice barely a whisper now. The humans didn't need to mass-produce them. Just knowing they existed was enough to break our will to fight. The old Vorthon looked around the nearly empty cantina, his scarred face reflecting decades of guilt and trauma.
Oh.
We realized that we weren't fighting a war anymore. We were fighting a species that could turn love itself into a weapon. How do you defeat an enemy that can weaponize your own grief? The question hung in the air like a death sentence, and everyone remaining in the cantina knew there was no answer. The humans had crossed lines that other species couldn't even imagine, and in doing so, they had made themselves the most feared warriors in the galaxy. But the price of that fear was written in the haunted eyes of every human veteran, including Captain Kim, who sat in the corner wondering what he had become in the name of survival. The silence in Murphy's cantina was so complete that it felt like being trapped in the vacuum of space. Even the ancient ventilation systems seemed to hold their breath. As Crystal prepared to share his final, most devastating revelation, the few remaining patrons sat frozen in their seats, afraid that any movement might shatter the fragile peace that had settled over the room. Like morning frost on a dead planet, Captain, Kim found himself leaning forward despite his better judgment. He had lived through the war, fought in battles that still haunted his dreams, but he had never heard the enemy's perspective on how it all ended. The official reports spoke of strategic victories and tactical superiority, but they never mentioned the deeper truth about what humanity had become in those final, desperate years. Crystal's massive frame seemed to age another decade as he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of civilizations that had been forever changed by human ingenuity and determination. The end came not with a great battle or a decisive victory, he began, his words falling like stones into still water. It came with a realization that chilled every Vorthon leader to their core. The ancient warrior described the final war council that had taken place on the Vorthon homeworld of Kethra Prime. The great crystal spires of the capital city had been darkened by emergency blackouts, and the planetary defense grid hummed with nervous energy as military leaders gathered to discuss their increasingly desperate situation. Admiral Zorthak was the first to speak the truth that everyone had been avoiding, Crystal continued, his throat sacs deflating with remembered shame. He stood before the High Council and announced that we were no longer fighting humans. We were fighting something else entirely, something that wore human faces, but had been transformed by war into creatures we couldn't understand. The old Vorthon explained how human tactics had evolved throughout the conflict, becoming increasingly sophisticated and terrifying with each passing month. What had started as conventional warfare between civilized species had devolved into something resembling the ancient myths of demons and monsters that Vorthon mothers used to frighten disobedient children. The humans didn't just adapt to our strategies, Crystal said, his voice growing stronger as he relived the memory. They anticipated them, countered them, then turned them against us in ways we had never imagined possible. Every victory we achieved came at a cost that grew higher with each battle. He described how the Vorthan military had been forced to develop increasingly brutal tactics to match human innovations. Traditional codes of honor had been abandoned. Civilian targets had been considered, and research into forbidden weapons had been authorized at the highest levels of government. But every time we crossed a line we thought would give us an advantage, Crickstill continued, his secondary arms twitching with remembered frustration. The humans would cross 3 more lines and make our sacrifices seem insignificant by comparison. The ancient warrior's good eye focused on something far beyond the cantina walls. Seeing ghosts from a war that had ended 2 decades ago but still raged in the memories of survivors. That's when Admiral Zorthak made his most disturbing observation. He told the High Council that to truly defeat the humans, we would have to become worse than they were. We would have to abandon everything that made us Vorthan. Captain Kim felt his chest tighten as he listened to the alien veteran's testimony. He had been there when human military doctrine shifted from defense to something darker, something that military historians still debated in classified academic papers. The transformation hadn't been gradual or planned. It had been driven by pure desperation and the realization that conventional warfare wouldn't be enough to ensure human survival. Humans fought differently than any species we had ever encountered, Crickstill said, his voice becoming quieter and more contemplative. The Kethri Empire fights for territorial expansion, conquering new worlds to feed their growing population. The Zephyrian Confederation fights for honor and glory, seeking to prove their warrior culture's superiority. We Vorthons fight for resources and strategic advantage, expanding our influence through calculated military campaigns. He paused to take a long drink from his nutrient tube, the blue liquid casting eerie shadows on his scarred features. But humans fight for something completely different. They fight for the right to remain human, to protect their families and preserve their way of life. That's not just a military objective, it's an existential necessity, the old warrior described. How this fundamental difference in motivation had created an impossible strategic situation. Every Vorthan victory had only made the humans more determined, more creative, more willing to embrace horrifying tactics. Destroying human colonies didn't break their morale. It convinced them that surrender would mean extinction for their entire species. We realized that humans don't see war as politics by other means, Crickstill continued, his voice heavy with hard-won wisdom. They see it as survival by any means necessary. When you threaten their existence, they don't just fight back. They transform themselves into something capable of ensuring their threats never arise again. The ancient Vorthon stood slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows across the nearly empty cantina. Most of the other patrons had quietly left. During his tales, unable to bear the psychological weight of such disturbing revelations, only a few hardy souls remained, and even they looked pale and shaken. The war ended when our High Council finally understood what complete victory would require, Crickstill said, his voice carrying across the silent room like a funeral dirge. To truly defeat humanity, we would have to exterminate them entirely. Not just their military forces, but their entire species. Every man, woman, and child in human space. He described how this realization had horrified even the most militant Vorthan leaders. Their species valued strength and military prowess, but they weren't genocidal monsters. The idea of wiping out billions of sentient beings was too extreme for their cultural values to accept, but the humans had made it clear that anything less than total extermination would be insufficient. Crickstill continued, his throat sacs quivering with remembered dread. They had demonstrated repeatedly that they would never surrender, never submit, never accept defeat. They would keep fighting until either they were all dead or their enemies were too terrified to continue. The old warrior moved toward the exit, his heavy footsteps echoing in the hushed cantina like the tolling of a funeral bell. But he stopped at the threshold and turned back to face the remaining patrons, his scarred face reflecting decades of guilt and trauma. The peace negotiations began the next day, he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the station's life support systems. Not because we couldn't win, but because we realized that winning would require us to become something worse than the humans themselves. We chose to lose the war rather than lose our souls. The Zephyrian recruits who had started the evening with such arrogant confidence now sat in stunned silence, their earlier boasts about human incompetence forgotten in the face of such terrible truth. They were beginning to understand that their military academies had taught them nothing about the real nature of warfare. "Remember this lesson well, younglings," Crixtel said, his ancient voice carrying the weight of civilizations that had been forever changed by human determination. "In war, the most dangerous enemy is not the one who fights to win, but the one who fights as if they have already lost everything. Because when you have nothing left to lose, there are no limits to what you're willing to sacrifice." As the ancient Vorthan warrior disappeared into the station's corridors, Captain Kim slowly finished his drink and stood up. His movement was careful and deliberate, like a man carrying invisible wounds that had never properly healed. The Zephyrian recruits watched him with new understanding, finally realizing that the quiet human in the corner hadn't been eavesdropping on their conversation. He had been living proof of every word Crixtel had spoken. Captain Kim's scarred hands straightened his jacket as he prepared to leave, but he paused at the recruits' table and looked down at them with eyes that had seen too much. "The old warrior was right about one thing," he said, his voice calm and steady, despite the pain behind it. "We paid a price for victory that we're still paying today. Every human veteran carries scars that go deeper than flesh and bone." He gestured toward the empty cantina, where the echoes of Crixtel's testimony still seemed to linger like smoke from a funeral pyre. "We won the war, but we lost something fundamental about who we were as a species. That's the real cost of survival when you're willing to do anything to protect what you love." The young Zephyrian sat in absolute silence as Captain Kim walked toward the exit, his footsteps measured and precise like a soldier still marching to the rhythm of battles fought decades ago. They finally understood that they had been mocking not just human military tactics, but the sacrifices made by an entire species to ensure their continued existence. The cantina remained empty long after both veterans had departed, the weight of their revelations settling over the remaining patrons like a shroud. The bartender, a grizzled Terran who had served drinks to soldiers from a dozen different species, quietly began cleaning glasses that were already spotless. Outside, stars continued their ancient dance across the void, indifferent to the stories of war and sacrifice that played out in the shadows of space stations and cantinas throughout the galaxy. But for those who had listened to Crixtel's testimony, the universe had become a darker and more complex place, where victory came with prices that could never be fully paid in the years that followed. The story of the Outer Rim War would be told and retold throughout the galaxy, becoming legend in some places and nightmare in others. But for the few who had been there, who had lived through the transformation of ordinary people into something capable of unimaginable sacrifice, the truth remained too terrible and too precious to share with those who hadn't earned the right. To hear it, the war was over. But its echoes would continue to reverberate through the galaxy for generations to come. And a reminder that survival sometimes requires becoming something you never wanted to be. The end.